Hello. If you're watching this video, that means that you want to do well at VFL Master Santiago. Now, I know some of you are thinking, well, TMV, you ain't the guy to tell me how to do well, because how did you do during kickoff? And you know what? That's fair. However, I am back. I am still here, and I am going to give you some hopefully helpful guides. You don't have to pick the same players as me, but hopefully some guides that might help you even if you end up with different players on VFL. So again, here we go. We're doing a Masters format. We've done this format a couple times before. You might have played in the Toronto format that was pretty much the exact same as this one. So, if you played Toronto, you'll be familiar with it. For those of you who don't know, just very quickly, there are 3 stages to this thing overall. The first one is the Swiss stage. So you want to pick players. That's the first tip. Pick players who are playing in Swiss, because otherwise you'll get no points. But yeah, pick players in Swiss. You only get their top 2 scores during each round. But yeah, pick the Swiss players to start. Then in the playoffs, we're doing up to the Final 4. And then the Final 4, you'll get 3 transfers between them. But this is where I think the main tip, the main kind of idea that you want to have for this entire tournament is when we get to that final 4 teams, right? And you get to this point here, you still want to have at least 3 players going through so that you can then have 6 players, by the time we actually get to this point of the tournament, right? That's going to be very, very important. Now, for those of you who remember Toronto, the people who ended up doing well in Toronto basically actually had double Wolves players because they were cheap and they went far, right? So if you had that, you were doing very well. So if you can predict, basically a lot of doing well in this kind of VFL tournament is actually somewhat predicting the teams that will at least get to this point, particularly upper final teams. The reason I say you want upper final teams in particular is because in this final week here, if you got a team in upper final, they're guaranteed to play at least one best of 5, right? They will at least play either the grand final or the lower final, and they might play in 2. Which is obviously great because, as we've seen from, Martin and whatever, or Forsaken, you can get a lot of points in these best of 5s. So if you can, you want to have, ideally, 2 players from each team in the upper final. That would be the ideal scenario. But the thing is, you kind of, these players that get to this point in lower round 3 aren't as valuable to you because if they lose this game, they just play 1 best of 3 in that final week, and they probably won't score that many points, particularly if they lose the game. So this is a bit of a prediction thing, to be honest, right? And you want to be thinking about it even as early as this point in the Swiss, picking your team. You definitely want to pick players who you think can make the playoffs. That's at least the bare minimum. But you can only make 3 transfers from this team to your playoff team. So obviously, the more players that you go through now, kind of the more flexibility you give yourself later on, right? If 3 of your players go out in the Swiss, well, then you have to get rid of those 3 players and bring in 3 new players from the playoffs. But then you're somewhat constricted, right? Because you have to take out those players. Whereas if you can correctly get 6 people through, well, then you can do whatever you want, right? And you can target matchups and stuff like that perhaps a bit better. So yeah, in general, I think you want to be thinking about who you actually will just think go the deepest in the tournament right now. And obviously that correlates somewhat as well with your team in terms of the first matchups. Now, here's the thing with this Swiss and the way it works, of course, we don't know who will play each other, right? So all we've got to go on is these first games, which obviously isn't great and isn't particularly easy to, take a look at and think, ooh, who's going to go through definitely, because you don't know who's going to play each other. And you might be like, ooh, that's tough. So when looking at these first games, I would say there's probably 3 games here where there are fairly clear favorites in Mates, NRG, and T1. And then there's a bit of a 50-50 game. But this is where this particular tournament gets so awkward, because probably these are the 2 teams that maybe you might overall feel the best about, or certainly up there, right? You feel confident about them making out of Swiss, but they play each other. So one of them is starting 0-1. If you can correctly predict, I said this in my Pick'ems video on the main channel earlier, if you can correctly predict who is going to win this game, I would feel good about that team then going through, right? If you can win this game, you can beat other teams, right? And you'll go through the Swiss. I feel good about that. However, can you correctly predict? Because whoever loses that game, chances are they're less than 50% at that point probably to make it out of Swiss. So Yeah, that's gonna be the real challenge here, because do I trust any of like Mates NRG or T1 more than like whoever wins this game? Not necessarily. So I think this is going to be a very interesting tournament. And of course, you have the prices to consider as well. Now, when it comes to the pricing, again, we can somewhat ignore, some of the players that are starting later on, like Danby and Lovers Rock here, for instance. But the prices in general, I think, are quite truncated. My top priced player is only 11.5. Now, it's been as high as 13 in some other tournaments that I've done for these kind of, international events. But 11.5 is the highest. The reason for that is because, yeah, Martin absolutely popped off, right? Him, Forsaken, and Danby, all popping off, all playing well. Obviously, Danby and Martin both duelists. But is the expectation, are we expecting Mates to go super, super deep? I don't know. Maybe some of you are, but I'm sure there are many who aren't, right? And I think it's difficult to know who to really be confident in. So the prices are quite squished together, which probably means you can make a team of people who you feel fairly good about overall. You think, oh, these names are pretty good, but are their teams very good? I'm not quite sure. And so pricing this one, I think, was more difficult than most because there isn't really clear favorites necessarily in this tournament. It's a little more unknown and a little more uncertain than usual. So I think that in this one, you're probably going to have to take a bit more of a risk. Now, again, when it comes to thinking about how to best succeed, it basically is a risk versus reward factor, right? Like I said, the people who did best in Toronto probably had like Spring, another Wolves player, on their team from the very start and just stuck with them, and they just happened to finish third, right? And they did well because they had two very, very cheap players who did extremely well, so they could fill up the rest of their team with very expensive players. In this Masters, though, am I confident in anyone going on a super deep run? Not particularly. So it might be just down to some gambles. And again, you might go, well, I feel good about the winner of G2 Paper X making it through the Swiss. So you might actually load up on double G2, double Paper X if you want to. And just feel like that's two players who I know are going through. And then I still feel pretty good about the other team. That might be one way of approaching it, right? Or you might say, let's spread it out, and I'm going to have a player from 6 different teams. That might be another way of just fully spreading out the risk and, hoping that you're right. But as I say, the more you can get through, if you do go, for a 3 teams and I'm going to pick 2 players from each, obviously if you get it wrong, you might as well just quit. However, you get it fully right, yeah, you will be in a very good spot from then on. So it is a bit of a risk reward thing of how risky you want to go in terms of kind of going all in on teams. And as I say, a lot of the points, a lot of kind of the final leaderboard standings will probably be determined somewhat more by the playoffs and kind of later on in the tournament when we get to those best of fives, particularly if a team plays in 2 best of fives and, really pops off in one of them.